get started. My name is Teresa. Sometimes students call me Dr. Hunt, but you don't have to call me Dr. Hunt. I always encourage them to call me Teresa, especially you, because you're very different than the students that I usually teach. I'm a member of the teaching faculty across the street at NJIT, so very convenient. Here I am. I'm also a DGA alum. I finished my PhD here in 2011, and I think I walked in 2012. I was one of those October defenses. I did like a September defense and then waited till May to do all the ceremonial stuff. So I understand you're master's and PhD students. How many of you will have some degree of field work pertaining to what your thesis will involve? Field work meaning you're out in the field, you're trying to gather information, or maybe you don't know yet. Maybe not. Well, that's what I'm discussing today. And I'm also going to talk about digital sociology, which is a relatively unfamiliar term to a lot of students and faculty as well. It's a field of sociology, or a subfield of sociology, that has been incredibly popular in some parts of Europe. So it really was kind of an innovative set of observations and then practice methods that started to develop in the UK and became very popular as a focus of study. Not as much in the United States, and I don't know why that is. I have theories for why that is, and it involves sometimes the personality of researchers or faculty members. But because it was so unfamiliar when I was starting my dissertation research and doing field work, a lot of my advisors were very skeptical about what it even was. What is this? You mean you're on Facebook talking to people? What is this? And yes, the answer is sort of yes, because at the time, it was a very exciting field opportunity. So I don't know where your field work is going to be. I don't know if for you that's the city of Newark and talking to people, kind of doing some degree of snowball sampling or something in an immediate area, or you're thinking, well, I have to fly to this country, and then I have to try to access this population in this country, which is going to involve like literally physical legwork. The attraction sometimes with a digital version of that kind of field work is that you have accessibility. And people who want to reach you, you're accessible to them too. Some populations feel almost more comfortable communicating online rather than communicating face-to-face for various reasons. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today because that's what I encountered. But how that then becomes something that is problematic for us as social researchers is also a really important consideration to have. So this is a talk that introduces some of this, some of the realities of field work, some of the limitations of tools of field work that are otherwise very attractive to us and seem to solve a lot of problems, right? So sometime around the turn of the century, right, the 21st century, like focus on internet socialization and social media, especially in the political spectrum, like the revolutions it was going to create or something, was a really popular thing to study in my universe. And I think it really intersected a lot of globalization studies too, because we're talking about access and speed. And I remember a metaphor when I was studying at the time that globalization is the internet, and the internet is globalization, right? That somehow these two are very symbiotic processes, and how does that impact us as researchers? This was a really intense conversation, I'd say about 10 years ago when I was sort of starting out the program. But is anybody a sociologist, or kind of pretend? I know you are. Or does any of your work pertain to social research? Is everybody a little bit? Psychology. Social psychology? Okay, so yeah, talking to people is probably going to be part of your routine in some way. Yeah, I mean, I think that digital sociology, is something, so this is the Digital Sociology Handbook, and this is a project that I was immersed in over the last couple of years. So some of my most recent research involves my activity with a digital sociology working group out of CUNY, and that was one of the first in the United States about 3 or 4 years ago. Two scholars who were really formative in this movement around digital sociology in the United States. Jessie Daniels, who is at CUNY, a sociologist at CUNY, and she studies race and the internet, does very interesting work on something called digital blackface. If you just Google that, you'll see probably some of her work and some of her writing about the kinds of maybe structural inequalities or some of the bias that we face and how it replicates itself online or not, right? In some ways, our online universes and personas free us from some of the structural differences, because visually, that whole landscape changes. And in some cases, it's reproduced. So Jessie Daniels, as a scholar of race, a sociologist who does work in the area of race, really wanted to think about how that represents itself in a digital world. And she thought, well, I'm in isolation. I mean, lots of people are studying digital everything, right, about 10 years ago, like I said, and I think that brought itself into global affairs, absolutely. But she thought, well, I must be in isolation studying this. And then she began to work with Tressie McMillan Cottom, who is now at Virginia Commonwealth University and is actually developing a master's program in digital sociology, which includes research methods and data analysis, which is what I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. But Tressie's work has been in the area, and one of her most recent publications was on online universities, some of which are private. They're almost all of them are accredited. Some aren't. The predatory ones aren't, right? Some of those are very well-known problems. But she was studying online recruitment in sort of online universities and how that impacts a certain social and economic class in particular, right? So what are some of the ways that online universities and online education are interwoven with some of our sort of stratified differences as a population? So who is most likely to be a student in an online university? How do online universities recruit digitally? What is the experience of students who don't have the resources, the time, the money, right? All of those are resources to land themselves in a face-to-face sort of school environment, maybe interspersed with some online learning, but really just have the experience through an online format. And what are they missing, right? This is part of the question, but she's not exactly an educational sociologist. She focuses more on social justice issues. And so her work is a very different kind of sociology where she's thinking about people's everyday experiences, right? And not necessarily representations of people online, but how they use online resources supposedly kind of with the assumption that it's going to make life easier for them. Right? A lot of the buzz around the digital world and the internet at the turn of the century, going into the 21st century, was about how it's going to make everything more accessible to people. Education, communication, access to knowledge of a political system, voting, right? There were so many different, almost utopian visions for what the internet could become as far as how it organizes people and how people feel connecting to it. And that, of course, took a set of very interesting turns, through the decade that followed, and certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. I think it took a very dark turn, right, in the last couple of years in terms of what the internet does as it organizes people and what the potential is. So maybe we were a little bit too utopian initially with our thinking about it. But the Digital Sociology Handbook, which I was involved in developing as a project, and that was a very interesting, just to kind of take a break for a second from the topic and to just talk literally about production of scholarly materials, which I think most of you will be involved in at some point. You're here, you're going to write a thesis or a dissertation, and hopefully that's going to push you into the arena also of working on a book project or working as a scholarly collaborative or a scholarly collective. How do you do that? What's the power structure there? How do you network? How do you get into that kind of opportunity? So what we did was we sort of followed a basic framework for what digital sociology was defined as by somebody who was really seminal in producing and popularizing the phrase, right? Deborah Luton was one of the first American scholars really to start mobilizing this term. And now, as I said, it's becoming this academic department. It's becoming a program for people. They're getting master's degrees in digital sociology. And when we're talking about things that are really driving a lot of scholarship, big data and what that means in our lives, wearable technologies, and how that relates to both the development and the design aspect for people who are in technology, but the ramifications or the sort of implications that it has for us as citizens, as everyday citizens. There are privacy concerns here. There are, I think, power concerns. There are certainly market concerns. So this kind of intersects into a lot of the fields that you're studying and the things that you'll be going into. But as we thought about putting together this handbook, because there really weren't any others of its kind, we thought, okay, let's follow one scholarly definition for what this is. Let's try to stick to, as the discipline's forming. And some of you might be in very new sub-disciplines, right? This is something that, like I said, when I was working on this, was so unfamiliar to a lot of my dissertation advisors. They were cautious. What is this? Is this a fad? Is this going to become a legit thing? As you try to go into getting a scholarly position, is this going to be significant for you 10 years from now? It turns out, yes, it was, right? But sometimes your advisors don't know, so they're sort of hesitant, and you have to take a risk a little bit in being part of something that you trust your, this was a trust your gut thing, right? That was sort of like, I think it'll work out, so I'm going to keep pursuing this. But there was very little written about it. So we produced this handbook thinking, how can we add to the field? Help people understand what this is, and so you leave this artifact of scholarship so that others can follow. So part of that for sociologists was thinking about just professional practice, really being visible online and using different kinds of new communication forms and taking them seriously. That using this for professional practice. And this has become, in the 10 years since the project really started, much more commonplace. So this is not necessarily surprising. Thinking about sociological analyses of digital use, researching how people use digital media, how that configures our sense of self, how it configures our sense of self as voters, I think is going to be something people really look at. I think that's going to be the subject of many dissertations, the 2016 American election, the elections in Kenya, the situation in Spain. I think there are so many different manifestations of, there's a component or there's a focus of how online realities have shaped the political outcomes. What direction does the arrow go in? Did this start as a movement that was digital? Did it start as a street movement? How do those two combine to create political momentum behind an idea? I mean, this is also something that people were talking about in the Egyptian Revolution or the Arab Spring, which a lot of people hate that term, the Arab revolutions. How much of this was created as sort of an online movement, or how do people connect online? So how that configures our senses of ourselves, but also our sense of whether it's an imagined community or it's a nation state in your mind or it's a literal population, what's the relationship there? It was a really important part of our work. And digital data analysis, and this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I kind of focused this on methodology, my talk today, but I'm certainly happy to talk about some of the other components too. Using digital data for social research, quantitative or qualitative, what are the ethical considerations there? What are the practical considerations there? How do you know as you're constructing a sample, and I'm not sure if this is familiar language to you or not, but you've reached a point of saturation with what you're trying to collect and the problem or the puzzle, the intellectual puzzle you're trying to solve. How do you know your sample is representative? How do you know you're even talking to who you think you're talking to? All of these are realities for people as they conduct research in the field, right? Social research digitally. And I think even for big data sets, there are ethical concerns using data mining services, which I know a lot of students do sometimes to work through a dissertation question. And then critical digital sociology and thinking about analysis of digital media informed by social and cultural theory, so bringing classic sociology to the digital. Can we translate? Can we take something like Max Weber's ideas and really translate them for a 21st century reality, all the good, all the bad? I don't know, right? That's widely debated. But we tried to form the volume around this. The editors certainly are credited with kind of pulling the project together. But what was really interesting and a unique experience for me is as this was coming together, they really called on all of us contributors to work through the editorial process together. And at first I thought, what is this mess? This is a hot mess right now. Like there are too many cooks, that expression, too many people involved with this project. Everybody has different ideas for what it should be. Well, I'm really proud of the volume. I'm proud of my work in it and my connection to it because I feel like it really represents us. It was not just a, let me drop my chapter and go. We met sometimes when we could using WebEx, or I'm close to New York City, a lot of us were, so we went to CUNY and we worked through this, or we worked online, and it was a big collaborative project. I mean, imagine writing a 23-chapter volume with all the people in the room here, and that's sort of what it would have looked like. I'm like, what a mess, right? And it took a while, but I liked their vision for a scholarship that was more inclusive and more representative, right? So we had people who were tenured, professor too, people who are, Saskia Sasson, I don't know if she's familiar to any of you, but she wrote the introduction for this volume. She's a human geography scholar, but also really well known for writing about global cities. So if you're thinking about that phrase, the global city, she did a lot of the work to sort of get that phrase out there and talking about transnational realities for people in different layers of the global city, so people who literally clean the offices of the people who are in the corporations making the decisions to make the city a global city. So she's an interesting and well-known in my universe. Like, I almost passed out when I heard she was writing the forward, writing the introduction. And I thought, is this what it feels like when you've made it? You know, and I don't, like, that's the only capacity in my life where I feel like I've made it, but that to me was really meaningful. So being involved in part of that process demystified, too, to me a lot about academic publishing. Right? And again, I think if you're sitting in this room, you're somebody who that's part of your future, looking to do academic publishing. And there's kind of the classic top-down way of blindly sending in a manuscript to a journal, crossing your fingers that they get back to you within 8 months, you know, waiting, like trying to be really patient, trying to understand who the editors are. Do I just cold call people? Do I answer a call for papers? I went through that entire process too. I still do, it's ongoing, but this was such a unique and interesting way to do a project. It was also very open access. I don't think now that the University of Chicago Press has taken this up and published it, I don't think it's open access anymore, but my chapter is still on the Social Science Research Network. You can just Google the title and find the entire chapter. A lot of the other chapters were too, and the editors were really insistent on keeping it open access for people. And I do think that's also a future direction for a lot of scholarship. So it's something to consider, the good and the bad, right? Sort of the good and the bad with that. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sort of a preface of what digital sociology is and my involvement in the project. Now, for my chapter, which discusses research methodology and using digital methods to construct my sample, sort of describes research that began in my dissertation study and then morphed into something that I continued to work on post-graduation as much as I could, because some of the people who were participating in my study were so far away I couldn't really, you know, keep talking to them. Some were comfortable using technology, some weren't. Some had access to technology, some didn't, because a lot of the participants were working in developing countries and global cities. So maybe they grew up in parts of West Africa or North Africa, but sometimes worked in Toronto because they had some sort of global fellowship, you know, that afforded them mobility. And they were involved in maybe social justice work. For a lot of the participants in my study, it would be feminist work, or a lot of them were working on reproductive rights issues, educational access for women and girls, life expectancy and maternal mortality. So these are some of the things that really strike developing areas more frequently. So those were some of the participants that I worked with. So I kept up the project and kept up connections with them as I could, and I was telling Natalie earlier that now that I have some funding too with grants, I try to maintain those relationships to say, hey, if you participate, can I send your organization some money? And that sometimes is very helpful. Let me move my cell phone so that doesn't happen again. Just flag me if I'm going over time. So one thing that was really complicated for me, and I'll talk about my study kind of in a longer form in a few minutes, and I could really talk about that for hours, like, which is an unfortunate thing for you. So I'll try to keep it short. But since you might be in the situation where you're thinking right now about defending a dissertation proposal, putting ideas together, I'm happy to backtrack later and make that the focus of question and answer session, right? So I'll try to kind of like make it a short explanation, but then I can elaborate as people are interested in doing so. But what I studied, let me actually flip forward to, what I studied were generation tensions, basically, the generation differences in an activist movement. So let's say you have something like Greenpeace, right? I'm trying to think of a very transnational or international organization that might have chapters in different countries. And you would have a range of members in something like Greenpeace. You'd have people who are in their 80s and have been doing this for decades and are connected to sort of earlier eco movements, right? Earlier generation eco movements, and very young people who are concerned about new questions with the environment and new policies. So what I wanted to look at in sort of the feminist version of something like Greenpeace, a really high profile, big name organization, is why in some cases lots of younger women were first identifying as young, which is a very culturally relative term. You know, what it is to be 18 years old in the United States is not what it is to be 18 years old in a more developing country, or even within the United States. Sometimes, you know, an 18-year-old's experience in a city like Newark is going to be very different than an 18-year-old's experience in some suburban Connecticut sort of setting, right? So age is so relative. You know, like what your experiences are as a young person is so specific to your culture, to your family. We can go sort of phenomenology with this and say there is no, you know, like young, it's all about individual experiences, not very practical as researchers who are trying to assemble a sample with like a similar profile, but it's something we can entertain. Certainly in feminist research, you kind of have to entertain that idea. But why then did I see repeatedly, as I kind of studied some really big, like 5 or 6 transnational networks that were involved in women's issues, why this phenomenon of youth organizations? And interestingly, the timing of this, it sort of followed the narrative, however inaccurate, that young people were really the engines behind a lot of those Arab revolutions in Egypt, in Iran. That it was young people who were fomenting this movement over Google engineers were getting it together and doing things. It was a narrative that was really popular in the United States, and it involved a lot of social media. There was this sort of like, oh, thanks to people putting things on Facebook, the movement's now out in Tahrir Square, and people are real, and again, kind of a false narrative, right? But there seemed to be this moment where we were really compelled to talk about youth on a global level. Again, as if it uniformly meant something, it didn't. I think that was one of the UN, like the Year of the Youth or something, I think was sometime around that era. And I think that term was having a moment. I don't know that young people were having a moment, right? Or that we can be very reductive about generations and generation differences. Sometimes, like I said, there's an allure of that as social researchers. Well, I'm going to bracket people off and say I'm going to talk to people from 18 to 23 years old, as if that constitutes some uniform population. We want it to, sometimes as researchers, but it doesn't always. Still, I saw this really common phenomenon of young women breaking off, and forming youth-only organizations. Once you hit age X, you're out. And I thought, what does that mean? What is this? Is this an ageist thing? Or, what explains this? And so a lot of this project in its dissertation stages, so that was sort of the earlier stages of my research, what explains this? When these women themselves will acknowledge, no, my experience as a young woman is so different than this other woman's in this network, because she grew up in the Philippines, I grew up here, she's a different religion than I am, I'm a more working class person, she had a lot of privilege growing up, so our experiences are nothing alike. Oh, but we're both 24. I'm like, well, then what explains your cohesion? And I'm not sure I really ever quite answered that question very effectively, right? I came up with a couple of different theories. I organized the data using a qualitative data analysis software program, which I could also talk about in case that's relevant to anybody today. But what's interesting is they felt constantly underrepresented as young people. That seemed to be a consistent observation. There was a frustration with age, and there was a frustration with what they often called conference feminism. This older generation, they have a lot of money, they've built up a long sort of repertoire of career experiences where they're invited to talk by divisions of the UN. They are constantly organizing these conferences and talking about their experiences from decades ago. And when I try to bring up something, if I can even get there, because I'm young and I'm broke and I can't afford to get there, if I can even get there, they won't listen to me and they'll go, you're 21 years old, you don't know anything. Right? So there was this real, well, I'm here now, and I want to tell you something, and there was a lot of energy and momentum, and maybe that's happenstance, right? But there was a lot of energy with the groups that I was discussing the issues with. So they kind of created a lot of so I had about 27 to 30 participants, some who sort of later in the process asked me to remove their information. So I didn't really include them in the final dissertation, but anecdotally I can tell you I talked to about 30 people. And they were really concerned with access. And so the question started to become how digital methods, or if a conference like the Association for Women in Development, AWID, which is a huge one, right, in our universe, and thinking about gender issues and development, if AWID has its global conference every year and young women can't exactly afford to get there, or if they can't, they don't have the presence, they're not represented well, can they create almost like online versions of the meeting places? Well, I'll Skype you in. We'll do something on WebEx. We'll do something on FaceTime. Is that a way for them to get into a conference or experience something to gain the almost like resume that they feel like they need to have? It is. And so for a lot of these young women, they felt that it was visibility, right? That the digital world was visibility for them in a way that they couldn't experience otherwise. And it was new and very confusing to older generations. That's not real activism. You're just talking on Facebook. I'm like, well, no, but it is activism. It's our version of activism. So I I noticed that as a tension, right? I wrote about that in my dissertation. Some of it, might be like psychology, kind of like family issues, like quite literally. Sometimes I was talking to mothers and daughters, and I thought, whoa, this is so way beyond my question of movement actors, social movement actors, and like there seems to be some family stuff I'm not really trained to talk about, so I'm not going to discuss it, right? But that was rare. And usually in my sample, there was a sort of consistent set of observations from older generations especially. If you really want to understand this, they would say to me, student researcher, if you really want to understand this, you have to get into their online universe. You have to ask them to be part of their Facebook group when they're discussing the next mobilization. So like, one set of activists, let's say, for example, in a sexual and reproductive health and rights network. There was one that I studied in Eastern Europe called ASTRA, the Astra and Astra Youth, right? So it was all about sexual and reproductive rights and health, right? SRHR, right? And they were party to some of the, sort of UN discussions of this. They had consultancy status, the older generation organization and the youth organization. So they were very active at the time that I was studying them, trying to do sex education, almost in sort of a pop-up street fashion. In Poland especially, it was outlawed, right? That there was no sort of official sex ed curriculum. In many parts of Eastern Europe, you had sex workers, some of who were trans women, really not receiving services at all, no health services, no sort of protective services. So the different kinds of pop-up activities this youth division was doing was trying to do streets, they called it street sex ed, like a very, I'm going to go to this youth group one day, I'm going to go to where kids hang out at the park, I'm going to distribute condoms, and I'm going to talk about birth control. I'm not supposed to do this, right? But I'm not officially a school, so I can get away with it under the Polish law. So there was that going on, and then some very targeted sort of health work going on in other countries in Eastern Europe. And they discussed it all on Facebook. And they didn't really meet face-to-face. They had other sorts of online resources that, again, I wasn't really aware of, but the older generations were saying you have to ask them to get in there. Have them add you as part of this group discussing this, and then you'll really understand what they're doing versus what we're doing, right? It was very separate. So thinking about the fact that something digital opened up these spaces for a lot of the activists in my sample, right, and kind of the sample of participants was hard for me because I think I straddle as a researcher, if I can do a reflexivity exercise for a second, as a researcher, I'm straddling those two different generations. So some of the activists were much older than me when I was doing this. Some of the activists were much younger, and there was sort of nobody around my age. I was in my 30s when I was working on this. And I thought this is an interesting position to be in. And a lot of feminist research methodology asks you to do this as a researcher, right? And then we can get into this whole discussion about like objectivity in social research, which again, if you want to and it's useful, I'm happy to do that, but it's sort of beside the point at the moment. So thinking about this idea of the others, and I took this term from Karima Benoon, who at one point was a faculty member here at Rutgers, New York, but I think now is at UC Davis. But she discussed trying to think past when you're conducting a research question or you're trying to gather data, thinking past the binaries that you see as part of that mainstream narrative. So when she was writing about the others, she was talking about doing research in Muslim fundamentalist countries and not being so afraid as a researcher, she herself is of North African descent, not being so, but like well situated in the United States as well. She was saying, I don't want to be so afraid of reproducing this sort of Orientalist narrative and saying, all Muslim fundamentalism is really anti-democratic, and we have to look at it as either a sort of fundamentalist approach to governance or a democratic approach to governance. She's saying sometimes we feel so trapped in that binary, we're very careful when we're criticizing the fundamentalist piece, right? And that's kind of that knee-jerk anti-Orientalist response where you don't want to be the person who's pointing fingers at the other and saying, you're very bad. So she's saying, I understand that caution, however, within that population you see stratification and differences as well, and we can't be so caught up in sort of that A versus B that we don't understand the nuances. And I took that as a kind of theoretical, methodological tool for my work with the digital universe too, because there's two different binaries that I was working in, the digital and the analog, right? So it's either online or it's offline. That's kind of the message that I was getting, which I thought this can't possibly be true. There's got to be layers of this. It's got to be more complicated. And then there's sort of the young old, right, that I was working with too. So either sort of everybody was, exclusionary and older generation, or all these young people were sort of very angry. There was this tension that was very dramatic. And I thought, well, that's like way too simplistic, so I have to kind of push past this. So the way I use the others is slightly different than Karima Banoun used it, was to think about who in this young group were othered, right? So you have a group of young people who are talking about solidarity, and they're showing solidarity in a particular way in digital representations of that solidarity. And as I'm trying to puzzle out who are the variables, right, or like who are the different sample populations as a researcher, I was really trying to think research design. As I design this and I stand up in front of people who've been doing this for decades and I try to defend it in a dissertation setting, right? How do I define and explain these populations? And something that was really interesting was that when I started working on the digital fieldwork, I interspersed it with face-to-face fieldwork because I had the opportunity to get to Eastern Europe to do it and to get to North Africa to do it. And people also agreed to talk to me. And another huge part of fieldwork is entree and access, right? And so doing something like snowball sampling and getting at hard-to-reach populations can be classically very difficult. I started reading studies around that time about digital snowball sampling and how easy it can be sometimes to add people on Facebook. Sometimes people are almost more willing in certain generations to connect with you online than they are to meet you face to face. And that's very true, I found, of younger people. Well, I don't know. Here's my information. Maybe I'll talk to you online. This is Google Chat was the big thing at the time that I was doing this. I think that's sort of passé at this point. But I'll talk to you online, but I don't know about meeting you face to face. So there was sort of almost a barrier that went up with the digital that in some ways allowed me more access to populations, and there's a lot of research on this. A lot of people have done research on snowball sampling through social media, especially Facebook. One really great study that came out in 2013, Balter and Brunet, B-R-U-N-E-T, did work on Argentinian shopkeepers and business owners in Spain, right, in the country, who would talk to them online, but sometimes not face-to-face because a lot of them were undocumented. And so they were willing to talk about their experiences as sort of minority business owners, but not necessarily in a public setting because they were really afraid of what that could, the implications, right? Well, if you can identify me as, my face, then I don't know about this. So in some cases, that's a really useful research methodology. I think especially in situations where you maybe have, developing countries or countries where there's a lot of political tension surrounding questions of people's status, right, and the power. So, and that part of my question was sort of status and power. But what started to happen for me, as I talked to people face to face, was learning how much some of the younger women felt frustrated, almost as frustrated as the older generations did about the limitations of the digital, right? So one young woman that I talked to who was in that Eastern European Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Network, Elena was her name, she is Romani. And she talked about Roma women's experiences and how she felt that so this is like a sort of political tension with a long history, but in a network full of young women who were mainstream citizens, she had citizenship, but it was sort of a conditional citizenship. I don't remember exactly what her situation was, but she felt like really underrepresented as a Roma woman first in that population, right, because she was sort of the minority population. And she said, everybody's nice, people are inclusive, but when they do things online, it cuts me out. It cuts me out completely because I'm not as familiar, I'm not computer literate. She wasn't really, that's my phrase, so to sort of quickly explain to you what she was trying to signify to me. She had some routine access to the actual tools of technology, but not enough familiarity with using the kind of medium they were using. And there wasn't this instinctual, maybe we're cutting out Alina by doing this. As we talk about and plan out, she was very interested in disseminating sexual health education as well to people who didn't have it, right? She was a person of relative privilege in terms of socioeconomic status, but just lacked familiarity with the systems they were using to communicate. So she often called herself a shadow person. It's like I'm there, but I'm not there. So she's sort of the other, like if the young people are othered by the older people, she's the other of the others. And that's why I like that metaphor so much. Another representative sort of example of the cautions of that digital sampling and digital research data gathering. There was a young Arab feminist network, sort of now defunct, but really headquartered in Egypt and kind of focused on the MENA region. So women from across the MENA region working together, also very, generation tension based, affiliated with AWID, which I brought up before, the Association for Women's Rights and Development. And another woman that I had talked to who self-identified as Nubian, right? So she felt like a minority, a black woman, right? Sort of saying like, we want to bring up these issues for women as well as other issues that the more dominant culture, sort of addressing in terms of women's rights and feminism in the region. And she did not have issues of access or computer literacy because she's in fact a software engineer, right? So she really knows, and kind of programs and designs a lot of the systems that the group was using, maintains a lot of the systems that the group is using. But she felt because that was her role and she was good at the technology, she felt like she was the messenger. So she wasn't creating the content as much, but because she was the designer, she was really doing a lot of the legwork. She was like the shopkeeper. She's sort of identified sometimes as the shopkeeper, and I thought that was interesting and disturbing, if I step out of my researcher mind for a second, because it suggests, again, there isn't this kind of uniform solidarity, right? But there's like a question we have to ask. So basically what was immediately representative to me as a picture, of these very easy binaries that presented themselves through the digital reality or the digital world weren't really accurate depictions or descriptions, right, of what the situation was. Had I not revised my plan kind of in the middle of my study and said, okay, well, I can't just do A, I can't just do B, I have to do sort of this hybrid approach to my field work, I would have missed these stories entirely. Because both of these women were telling me this face to face. They didn't feel comfortable leaving almost like a digital trail of communication here. What if somebody sees that I wrote this to you? What can I tell you face to face that I'm not comfortable saying online? So it's almost the reverse of that study that I just described a moment ago with the Argentinian shopkeepers in Spain, sort of the opposite. I feel safer talking to you face to face. I don't want to do this online. What if there's some archive of our conversation? Everybody knows I'm complaining about them. And for these women, it's sort of a lower stakes social sort of transgression or something like that. But it could be also meaningful for them in terms of cutting them out of some employment. These were both paid positions for these women. These women did not want to lose these jobs. Sort of the younger groups running this thing find out that I'm complaining about them. Will they fire me? Like, this is income for me. So I think that, my conclusion in the end was to sort of think about trying to triangulate, basically. I'm thinking, how can I quickly explain this? Doing any kind of data triangulation is often very important in research, especially in social research. It gets hard to know how to do that in qualitative-only studies, right? Mixed method studies kind of almost have their own natural triangulation. If you are looking at different types of data gathering mechanisms, you almost always have that sort of like, question or issue of generalizability or validity solved to some degree because you're doing a mixed method study. My study was only qualitative. So I thought, how can I, and especially when you bring in a digital setting for the research and the data gathering, how can I work on something like triangulation? I did find something very helpful, well, two things that were very helpful to remember as methodological pieces, because there's so many ethical considerations here too, is Kevin Depew's discussion of triangulating digital research. And he is a scholar of rhetoric, and he studies digital rhetoric kind of for students who are doing writing exercises online, and educational programs that design, writing for the online environment. This is really popular in a lot of like college writing programs, helping students understand how to communicate online, because it's part of our reality, right? But how you triangulate that is to think not just about the content. So if I thought only about the content, as the older generation activists were suggesting I do as the researcher, I would have missed the person behind, right? And I would have missed the design of the site and how it is or is not conducive to communication, right? So something like Twitter, especially, now it's kind of taken on, like I said, its own strange beast, and people have these reactions when you say Twitter. I don't know why. It's become this artifact of weird, I think, in 2017. But if something limits your communication capabilities, right? If something kind of confines the way you communicate into a particular fashion, and you trying to get used to that as a speaker is a challenge in and of itself, whether literally with language or kind of more figuratively with computer language, or even in a third way of saying, well, this just isn't enough space for me. I need to just talk this out to you. I can't really talk to you this way, but everybody else will only talk that way. That's difficult. And you need to know that, right, as the researcher. So looking just at the content, one side of the triangle, looking at the person who's delivering the content, literally who's on the other side of the screen, but also thinking about the design of the site. You know, what does it lend itself to? What does it not lend itself to? So suddenly I found myself in the world of trying to understand the design of these different mechanisms of communication. You know, I started looking at the history of the guy who developed the like button on Facebook and kind of the psychology behind all of that. And there's a social dynamic that for the user, but also for the community, there's a sort of momentum that can build that can be unconscious, right? So thinking about the design of the site in the context of the issue that you're studying is a really important process of triangulation that really helped me. And it helped me defend my dissertation, because there were huge questions about methods at the time. This was really unfamiliar territory. You know, even I would say even 3 or 4 years ago when we started working on this collective, when we presented this to the Eastern Sociological Society conference in New York City, I think in 2013, people were sort of like, what is this? You know, like this, there's a lot of skepticism that I think slowly, you know, is eradicating as people understand the centrality of the role something like that seemed to play, again, in the election. Whether that's true or not, I mean, the US election, it seemed to be the question of the moment. Like I said, I foresee a lot of dissertations covering, you know, the role Facebook played in the 2016 American election. But this was not yet the reality or the truth. So the other thing that helped me was Marie Default's this question of women's standpoint, which is a pretty, you know, well-known, you know, feminist theory phrase, standpoint, but operationalizing that in terms of methodology. Default talks about when you're doing field work and you're making observations, especially with people who feel disprivileged in some way, right? So it doesn't have to be, you know, specifically I was thinking about these younger women, but also within that population of younger women who was othered, right, in that population. She emphasizes in conversation analysis techniques and data coding techniques, looking for verbal pauses, looking for quieter voices, looking for the body language, where a lot of the, again, the two representative examples I gave you, those women, when they were communicating to me, would often sort of get quiet, turn away, not make eye contact with me. Well, no, it's a great organization, except for when these things happen. You know, and then sometimes there was a rage, right? They cut me out of this again. I'm just really frustrated, you know. So the tone of voice, the silences sometimes, the reluctance, you know, things you can't see on screen because they'll be maybe deleted, the content will be curated, the content will be erased and rephrased depending on the savvy, right, of the user. That you're missing too in the digital universe. And I understand the question of access gets tricky, right, depending on the population and what they feel comfortable with, but that was something that was also very helpful for me in defending in terms of questions like why not just make this digital, right? If this is about digital activism, like what justifies you spending this resource to actually get there to talk to the people face to face, and an analysis of those kinds of characteristics in the sample as well kind of explains that, I think. But methods are always about explaining, right? Being transparent, but also kind of defending your choices. So that's my project. That's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today. But I'm happy to answer questions about any aspect of this or the process, again, of like academic publishing. And I'm going to push this book again. We're very proud of this because we feel like it was a group effort. Again, it wasn't just like email your chapter and we've accepted your chapter and here are our edits and you're done. Here's the book, here in your hand. You know, that's all exciting, but this was so exciting because we saw how it came together. And actually worked with Policy Press initially, and University of Chicago Press here in the United States. But we worked with the publishing outfits as well to kind of see how it would all come together, and that was super exciting. So, what questions can I answer?
Yeah, I wonder, digital social movement is sustainable and stable because usually social movement in the online can emerge suddenly and fast, but it can be disappeared quickly. Right. So yeah. This is not stable, and then maybe offline activists think this is not core member.
Right.
So
right.
How to deal with that?
It's a very, very important question that I think is a very new and timely question. I think that's the other part of it. So when I was doing this research, this was the online representation of offline movements. You know, so it was something that had, I mean, AWID is 1970s. I mean, I feel like, you know, this was the one network I was studying. This is a decades-old network that had a new generation that said, we need to get online. You know, like this is some of the only access we'll have is for participants online. But that's a really important question about sustainability. It's looking at the starting point from another, in another way to say, what about something that only starts online? What comes to mind for you when you're thinking of that? Can you give us an example of a social movement that's was something that I'm thinking of one.
Sometimes in the election time,
yeah.
some supporting movement for some candidate is very popular in the in majority population, and then after that, this kind of passion and movement shrinking down and then disappear.
Yeah. Because it's convenient, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, it makes activism accessible to a lot of people, but then what's the commitment level, right? And this almost, I think, gets into our questions about how distracted we all are because of social media. You know, can we maintain focus on anything? From our children to our studies to a social justice, you know, kind of cause. I don't know that I have an answer for you about that, but I can say as a social movement scholar of sorts, it's morphed so much. You know, our questions about how to understand and comprehend, you know, social movements and online activism is to sort of say, like, the dynamic and the landscape has changed so much because it's not just an extension anymore of a face-to-face or street movement. It's a movement in itself. And I think people still don't know exactly what to make of it. Maybe it's too new, but what a good thing to study. What a really interesting thing to study. The one I was thinking of is sometimes there are very, like you said, in the moment movements that are trending. I hate that term, but it's you know, how committed is somebody to ending child soldiering? Well, I don't know, I made this donation on Facebook, so I guess I'm part of the movement, you know, and then sort of where does the money go? Then the momentum disappears. And then that same person, if you talk to them and you say, you know, a year later, well, you were involved in this movement, they'll go, I was? You know, but there's a very shallow or superficial knowledge of it. On the other hand, you know, would that person in that hypothetical situation have understood what that even meant prior to that? Maybe not, right? So these are really important, very difficult questions, I think, to answer. And there's so much more to study, you know, so much more to study, which is really, I mean, not even 10 years ago when I was working on this, I mean, the landscape has changed dramatically, which is interesting. What else?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there a connection between scholarship and policy?
Yeah.
Whether this digital social movement has really generated sufficient or significant steam to really tilt the balance of policy in affecting decisions that can really go back to some of these right issues, human rights, reproductive rights, your child labor. Has it really generated enough steam for policy to begin to take the movement so serious that it can really go back to really help alleviate problems? Because we're looking at how we can be able to synthesize some of these things to solve problems in the society. Has it generated that kind of steam that policy is taking it serious?
It's a really important question. I mean, what's coming to mind for me are some examples where, let's just forget the digital, let's just say technology, you know, has really played a role in momentum of awareness, and that might sway people's votes, right? That it depends on if you think about somebody, so the policymakers, we're thinking about the actor being the policymakers, right? If they feel a degree of pressure because what's being communicated by the populace, you know, out there, the plebes out there, is that this is a really important issue and a really important cause, and there's pressure on them to make legislative changes, I think the answer might be yes. You know, I can't exactly connect, for example, marriage equality with an online movement in the United States, legalizing gay marriage, right, marriage equality. But I think that, I don't know, you know, it's a question of whether or not, because of the momentum, because online activities keep it so much in the consciousness of the American public, that it might motivate people to continue pursuing court cases, right? This is a Supreme Court decision eventually, right? But I think, you know, does the movement keep the discussion present? It does. You know, so this is almost less of a question of the role that digital technology plays and more of a role in discourse. Like if the just to use the United States example, if the American population is really discussing something and it's constantly trending, sorry again for that word, I really don't like that word, but I think it encompasses what I mean. It keeps pressure on politicians, but it also seems to empower civil society actors to keep the momentum going, right? So it's hard to work in isolation, right? Especially as a movement actor. If you feel like you're the only person behind the cause, if you feel like nobody cares about this, you stop trying to make those more meaningful changes. You stop putting pressure on politicians. You stop getting out in the street demonstrating. If you feel that it is part of the world of conversation and there is support for you, and sometimes even if the support is only digital, I think it encourages people to keep a forward momentum. Is it everything? It's not everything. Is it part of the movement? I would argue it is. But I agree with you. I mean, we have to think almost in terms of concrete examples. Where have we seen policy changes because of this particular kind of action? And it's hard to know that that's the actual determining factor, right? To use the language of methods for a second, there are too many confounding variables. Was it this online movement, or was it because the politician had some other cause to finally make this decision? You know, if Facebook didn't exist, would this law have changed? Maybe, maybe not, because there's so many things contributing to that change, it's hard to know. But this is a really important question. You know, how seriously do people take it? And again, I have to say, I think it's going to be a major question for future political outcomes too. But this is a good question. Thank you.
Based on your presentation discussion, I read a piece last night called Power Shift by Jessica Matthews. And it made me think of, because it says information technologies disrupt hierarchies and it spreads power among people and groups. So
what's the author's name?
Jessica Matthews. I can show it to you.
Matthews?
Yeah. So that made me think of this, like, how does it influence policy and how does it influence the election? And, you know, when you have the privilege of having internet access, how does that separate the others who don't have that?
A lot. The digital divide. I mean, this was, again, you know, thinking about like a set of goals, you know, kind of constructed around eradicating global poverty. What was the United Nations, the Millennium Development Goals, right? So a big one was thinking about internet access. I mean, this is kind of, it seems like a luxury, or it feels like something that is sort of non-necessity when we're talking about people who need access to clean water, you know, and an environment that's secure, like human security. But it was constantly a narrative in a lot of the discussions of eradicating global poverty for just this reason. You know, it seems to be so much a part of the daily landscape, and it's increasing globally. I mean, we could just look at the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, their statistics on internet use and penetration, and the age, you know, how many people have access to mobile devices, surprisingly increasing exponentially. As that technology becomes more widely available and cheaper, it's, you know, people can access it. But that also means that for the population that can't, the world is becoming more remote in terms of really getting in and understanding, right? Political situations especially. So I think that's really important to think about also. Yeah, sure.
With net neutrality being threatened a lot, how do you think that would influence these communities that only band together online?
I mean, a lot. You know, it's sort of everything, because these are definitely, I would say that the participants for my study, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Manisha Desai, who writes a lot about women's issues and global landscape too. They are definitely transnational activist class. That there's a class of people who are activists who are kind of in this transnational circuit. They have access to things like the internet and high-speed internet, and that's everything, right? It's sort of this net neutrality question. So even for them, though they're kind of privileged actors in social movements, this is not a peasant movement, for example, but they might be like advocates for a peasant movement. They might be literally connected to people, right? They could be sort of bridge people, to use another feminist metaphor. But they didn't have that much privilege that they could sort of afford to be in the position of, you know, privilege that you need to be into when you really have that high-speed access. that seems to be reserved in the model that's looking more and more like it's going to be a reality for corporations, right? I think that's the thing that's very troubling about that. I mean, that really takes that utopian vision we have for what the internet could be and breaks it a lot. So the things we didn't foresee, I think at the turn of the century, in the year 2000, when everybody thought this is gonna be great, but you know, the internet started as a military project anyway in the first place, so I don't know quite how we forgot about that. But this is a really good question too, I think. What else?
I was wondering whether the people you surveyed and talked to had sort of self-reflection on their impact, on how effective their digital communities were in addressing the issues that united them in the first place.
Yeah.
Just because you know, this is a slightly sort of younger way of organizing, and we know that sort of evaluation is a big headache for even quite established organizations that do have to report to say funders and whatnot. But with these communities that in a sense they're only self-accountable to a degree, how much of a concern did you encounter with this? My personal experience with asking such questions to sort of exactly organizations that are digital movements that are activists, Facebook for instance, is it because there is no actual separation between their online identities and their work as activists. It's extremely threatening to explore this, how effective you are. And people do push back when you ask this question. What did you find?
Lots of pushback at the time. And I think that's more of, again, doing this at this point 7 years ago, really, like when I started. There was less of an awareness of this in the discourse, that there is this, like, we're curating our lives through online, there was sort of I think they felt like it was a more real representation of who they were. So it's almost like I wouldn't have thought to ask that question at the time. But even getting into, and it's a very good question, and I think I would ask it now, but even getting into that slight territory, what's your name, sir? You asked the question about? Kristen? Kristen's question about how effective is this actually going to be is like really related to, so what are you actually doing, right? But I think because, again, thinking reflexively, what I symbolized to a lot of them was that I was not a young person. When I asked that question, I was met with a lot of resistance. This is really important work that we're doing. It is very meaningful. We are doing something really effective. In terms of affecting policy change, I don't know that their main mission in this micro example was so macro in terms of actual policy change. They were very focused on the micro politics of, I just want these girls to understand how pregnancy works because we have such a high rate of young people getting pregnant, abortion's outlawed in this country, but so is sex ed. What are we supposed to do about this? So if they felt like they could reach small populations because of, they connected that to the online work that they were doing, they felt like it was very effective, right? But these are almost bigger macro questions that either I didn't think of to ask about the relationship between, or they were very resistant because it almost seemed like I was going down a path of, well, what are you really even doing? And that made me part of the older, side of the binary where I'm questioning, is this real activism? Because that was the fire question. That was the, that was the question where it was like, you would then encounter
measure of success, like
right.
their own self-measure of success.
Yeah. What was their measure?
So how would they know that successful in like their version of?
I think doing the action, right? Doing the action of, we were able to actually pull it off. We went into that youth center in that city. We were able to talk to them, right? I distributed all these materials that they won't get through the public school. Or we handed out, I remember one activist was talking about handing out bananas to a lot of young sex workers who were really hungry, and there weren't a lot of resources in some, or they were afraid, they were afraid to access otherwise, public kind of government shelters or resources, but they really felt like they were involved in that kind of micro level, and they would give me stories. Their measure of success was, well, one time this, one time that, then our friend did this, but then this other person who does the youth organization in Azerbaijan had this story to tell us, and we really feel like that keeps us going. And they would share the stories, they would post them online, and I think that was also maintaining a sense of community and continuity, though this group is in Poland and this group is this included the Balkans as well, this one organization. So I think that's a really good question. As far as the macro, not as much. But again, I wasn't really thinking to ask for it because I, in a semi-structured way, just wanted them to talk to me. And then I thought, I'll try to sort through this later. Yeah.
How much talking about youth age,
Yeah.
I think advocating for youth age is important thing because there is some specific requirements or problems that's specific for this age. So like I was part in an organization which was advocating for young refugees, and we were focusing into access to tertiary education. So this access to tertiary education is related for them. So that's why we felt the need to find youth organizations that for this.
Yes, that's right. That's great. Specific to young people.
Yeah,
you know, and that almost is
there's specific thing that's for young
Right.
people, and I think all people can do it.
Yeah.
And children are not
Right.
included within this age. So
Right, right.
that-
Yeah, and it becomes almost a specific type of youth
Yeah.
also. We're not talking about very young children, but
Yeah.
sort of in that like coming of age. I don't like that phrase either, but that kind of, all these like cliche phrases you try not to fall back on when you're looking at like the really trying to get into what this actually means. That's an excellent point, you know, that, and a point that a lot of the, you know, when we had this question of, but how are you organizing around this term that's so
definition for youth age.
No,
Because
no.
the United Nations is different than the European
That's
standard,
right.
than the US
Right.
standard.
Yeah, the UN's like 15 to something, and then there's right, and I know that's, yeah, I'm sure that's still true. It was the case when I was doing all that lit review stuff for my dissertation, looking at the different ways that people define youth. At the same time, as you said, there are specific experiences to people who are, just like there are specific experiences to people who are like at the end of their life, you know, like end of life stuff is sort of, there's universals, like wherever you are in the cult, there's sort of like a unique set of experiences that might say, bond people who are otherwise very different culturally. I think that's a really good point too. Yeah, that was everything too. For my dissertation committee, it was everything to sort of really define youth very carefully. It's not biological age, well what is it then? You know, so I spent pages and pages doing that kind of research, doing, you know, how do people define this in a scholarly capacity, in a policy, you know, praxis, kind of operational capacity, like, you know, when you say you're a youth, this is the youth division, what do you mean? I mean, do you literally kick people out when they turn 22? Like, what does this mean? So I had to ask so many questions like that. So many questions. In some cultures, for some women, it was marriage. Well, this one got married, she's 19, but now she's not a young woman anymore. You know, so it depends on, really depends on how, it was so hard to make the argument, even methodologically, that I had a, you know, sample that was relatively uniform, that I could extract some meaning from, you know, for the kind of thing that academics do, which is what you have to do. So that was very difficult. And not everybody agreed, but the important thing was that at my dissertation defense, they sort of wound up arguing with each other and were less concerned about whether or not I did a good job. Well, I don't really think, but it was almost more of an epistemological argument than it was about whether or not I did a good job. So I'm like, okay, we're past that, I'm gonna relax. Like, I'll be good. Anything else? So fieldwork is not really part of what you're doing. Some of us, it's gonna be part of what you're doing, talking to people, fieldwork, or you have a question?
So I'm kind of interested in this this theme of agency, and I think that it's sort of like an ambivalent term.
It
It's kind
is.
of broad and it's very. I'm interested in the ambivalence of it and how it kind of shifts back and forth between agency and constraint, and how privilege and disadvantage can kind of be can kind of shift back and forth depending on the context. And I think that using the internet can actually be a really good way to analyze that. And I have kind of an example actually that's related to what Corey was talking about that sort of illustrates this. I was actually involved sort of behind the scenes in the same organization she's talking about.
What is the organization?
The Global Refugee Youth Consultations, is that what you?
So yeah, I was part of the Global Refugee Consultation, which was part in Geneva.
Got it.
And
Interesting. Okay.
So I was kind of like helping assist that, or sort of I was kind of a fly on the wall.
Right.
But I was working with another guy who was sort of, he was like not part of the organization, but he was one of our clients in like kind of a satellite organization, and he was above the cutoff. He didn't make the age cutoff.
Ah.
And he was, he didn't tell this to me in person, but he kind of, he messaged me online on Facebook Messenger actually to kind of express his grievance.
Probably easier for him to do that.
And I don't think that he actually, I don't think he felt comfortable to do this like in person, but he kind of like used this online platform to kind of, I don't know if I would call that agency, but he was kind of like expressing his anger.
Yeah.
And, I felt a little bit like coming from my own privileged position, like I kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable. The fact that I was kind of this like gatekeeper, and I did go to like another person who was helping to organize the consultations, and you know, I kind of went to them and said, like, can we maybe get him in, because he has a lot to offer, and he also has this forced migrant background, but he's just a year too old.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of frustrating, but I feel like, I wonder if that can kind of be like viewed in terms of like agency versus constraint, and like how to kind of like analyze that. But
definitely.
I feel like, you know, using the internet as like a point of analysis can kind of like open up.
It can. Oh, it can. I mean, something I'm working on. So my research took like a very sharply different turn, because you'll find this too. Whatever institution you're in kind of influences the questions you're asking, especially if it's an institution that encourages collaboration like NJIT. So right now I'm studying the question of like STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math, and underrepresented students. And it's a place that's very unfriendly to women, and I'll just be out saying that. You know, like NJIT is notoriously not woman friendly. We have so many anecdotal examples and research, you know, like kind of valid examples for why that's true. But when I'm looking at underrepresented populations, and here's sort of the connection to the idea of agency, you know, through internet, you have to almost have this baseline understanding of what people's technology identity is. You know, if this seems like somebody who's comfortable communicating in that medium, almost more so than a face-to-face setting for something that could potentially bring a lot of conflict, right? So this could really be a moment of an intense conflict that could alter the situation that you're describing here, my entree into this, my inclusion in this group or not. So let me find one person, and let me just like quickly write an email, because that's like, you know, I have, so the technology identity piece that I'm studying is like preparedness, but also comfort level, what technology means in the person's life. You know, for some students it is just a tool of everyday communication. To other students it's regarded with suspicion. You know, if they didn't really grow up with it, it's like, what is this thing that you want me to keep just buying into and buying more of? You know, when I landed at NJIT, I was given a laptop, but now I have to update it. This is expensive. Are you just doing this to get money out of me? I mean, I've literally had students say this to me, and I thought, okay, you have a very specific kind of technology identity that's making that sort of access to that communication platform difficult for you. So that student might have a different way of communicating or not. I mean, that's also the danger. But that's interesting, because your agency and your understanding of it's not a tool that doesn't have a social, you know, dynamic around it. Like we often treat technology as like, this is not a thing that has any sort of politics around it, right? It's just an artifact, it's a thing, right? But there's a whole politicization around something like the internet that I think impacts that question. But this is a really good one. I think you just
goes beyond like functionality.
Oh, functionality. You'd have to consider that. You know, if you wanted to do any kind of study with it, you'd almost have to understand like the baseline experiences of the subject or the participant. But it's a really good question. An interesting example. Anything else?
Do you find the face-to-face talk communication with interviewees more conducive to your research than through digital or online, digital interview?
Yes, I do. I think that also reflects who I am as a researcher, because I didn't grow up, you know, immersed in this universe. I mean, this became more accessible when I was in college, so I mean, it wasn't exactly who I was as a learner. As I learned to interpret conversations and talk to people, as I learned social interactions, technology was not involved at all. However, for this study, what really tripped me up is that some people talked to me. I got more answers to my questions. I got more rich data sometimes online than I did face-to-face. So I think it depends on the question. Normally, I'm not comfortable with that. I want to talk to people. But I realize they don't want to talk to me sometimes, right? That they'd rather communicate online. They're not comfortable with physical interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge. That was a challenge for me too, because I had to almost understand what my patterns were with data interpretation and coding and all the things that you do when you transcribe an interview or something. I almost had to like re-envision a lot of what that was. It's still a challenge for me. I think it will be. I hope I'm in the middle of my career, not at the end of my career. So like hopefully going forward, it's going to be even more important as a question for me. Right? All good questions.
Theresa, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I love talking about my research, and very few people want to hear about it. So.